Well, hello and welcome to week 7 of Theology and Entertainment. This week we're going to talk about the economics of entertainment. The term economy is really a broad term referring to the household law. It's a combination of two Greek words, but in a more specific sense, a lot of times we use it talking about the financial component of ordinary life. So I think there's some interesting things to reflect on regarding how economy and entertainment come together. One book I want to recommend to you, it's not a required reading or it's not one of your assigned textbooks, but it's a great book called How Not to Be Secular by James K.A. Smith. And he talks about this topic among other things in this book. And he points out a couple of interesting things. So I want to read you just a couple of passages from this book talking about labor and worship, some of the things we've already talked about in this class, but about how Christianity has tended to hold in tension these two seemingly opposing goals, one of a spiritual life and one of a practical life, if you will. All right, and so Smith says that in Christendom, that's a culture of Christianity, particularly in Europe, in the Middle Ages is what he talks most about. But he says there was a unique tension between self-transcendence, a turning of life towards something beyond ordinary human flourishing, and the this worldly concerns of human flourishing and creaturely existence. We might redescribe this as a tension between what eternity required and what the mundane vagaries of domestic life demanded. It was assumed that human life found its ultimate meaning and telos, in purpose, in a transcendent eternity, and that the demands of securing such an ultimate life required a certain ascetic relation to the pleasures and demands of mundane domestic life. The spiritual disciplines of the saint are a lot to ask of the nursemaid or the peasant laborer who is pressed by more immediate concerns. This equates to a tension between the demands of the total transformation which the faith calls to and the requirements of ordinary ongoing human life. And so Smith is pointing out, building upon the work of Charles Taylor, he's pointing out that this tension needs to be dealt with, this tension between our desire as Christians to live a spiritual life, to be called to eternity, and to work out our sustenance and protection and all those things that we need for earthly life. And one interesting thing he points out is that historically, particularly in the Middle Ages, one of the ways they did this was through religious communities and monasteries. And that the lay people, all the way from kings to peasants and commoners, would financially support religious communities for the work. Remember, Pieper in his books about leisure and festivity talk about the need for real effort in the life of prayer, but that monks and sisters would do the work of prayer, the opus dei, right, of prayer and worship on behalf of these lay people, because these lay people realized they didn't have the time to dedicate to it. So they really saw themselves as being intertwined communities, that the priests and the religious brothers and sisters, the monks, would do this religious work on behalf of the people. Okay, so they were working together. A lot of times our modern mind doesn't understand that somebody living in a community, even a hermit, is really a communal being. So they kind of understood this a little bit better in the Middle Ages. So that's one way that they got around this tension between work and prayer, or mundane reality and spiritual reality. Thought that was interesting. But he also says that a second way is that, quote, he says, the social body in Christendom has a sense of time that allows even those engaged in domestic life to nonetheless pursue rhythms and rituals that inhabit this tension between the pressures of now and the hopes of eternity. And so he says that there's rituals that allow us to kind of balance this pressure and to relieve this tension. Now he uses some kind of negative examples, like Carnival, where people would basically suspend all of their religious values in order to go nuts and go wild, right? To blow off steam. But I think in a more positive sense, we can talk about some of the ritual and the festivity that Pieper describes as a way to hold this intention that we work in order to satisfy our needs, but we always give a primary place to worship as a time to set aside that mundane work in order to give preference to the sacred. All right? So just a couple of thoughts from Jamie Smith. The subtitle of his book is Reading Charles Taylor. So there's about an 800-page book called The Secular Age by Charles Taylor, but this one's only a couple hundred pages, so it's a great read. But I want to talk about a couple of other things in addition to what we've included in the assigned readings for this week. Just emphasize the impact that our economic lives have on our lives of entertainment. That we have to have a certain level of stability in order to pursue lives of leisure, if you will. Okay, now I want to kind of to present two sides to this question. Okay, the first side would suggest that it's only when we've achieved this affluence that we can pursue lives of leisure, right? You might say, well, gosh, I'd love to, have time for leisure and art and poetry and worship, but I can't afford it. I gotta have all this work to do. So in that sense, we can say that the closer we can get to material abundance, the holier we can get. Okay, and I think there's some truth to that. Is that if you're using your wealth for good purposes, those can go hand in hand. But at the same time, there's always been this Christian perspective that we can transcend the mundane reality of our lives and enter into this spiritual reality even when we don't have our material needs met. And so I think of some of the examples of the great saints, like St. Francis of Assisi, who renounces material wealth, and in doing that, lives a life of real festivity, of real joy. So that can happen too. That's one of the radical things about Christianity, matter of fact, that Jamie Smith talks about in his book, but that it calls us to something that exceeds human flourishing. Okay, now the pagan philosophers, the Greeks and the Romans, they talked a lot about human flourishing, eudaimonia in Greek, okay, human flourishing. But it was on a purely natural level, okay? It was to exercise our natural faculties with ease. It was to achieve lives of comfort that we could pursue leisure, but it was on a much more natural level. All right, the pagan philosophers, for example, thought that work, that manual labor, was beneath the dignity of a free person. Okay, that was just for slaves. Okay, that was just for hired workers or forced laborers. But the true man of leisure wouldn't have his hands sullied by, farming or by any kind of mechanical work. One of the radical things about Christianity was that it saw dignity in real work, right? Saint Joseph, the father of Jesus, is the patron saint for workers. He was a tekton in Greek. So a lot of times we say he was a carpenter or maybe a stone worker. Okay, that there's real value in working with your hands when it's done for a good purpose. And so some of you have talked beautifully, I think, in your discussions about feeling leisurely even when you're doing manual work. And I think there's some real truth to that, and there's some great spiritual insight into that. Integrating this idea of festivity to all of our week. Okay, so that's the whole point, is that the idea of setting aside Sunday as a day of leisure, well, that should inform all of our week. So that means that those other 6 days that we're laboring, we have this hint of festivity even at that. So I think there's something beautiful in that. But still, I think that in maybe a more concrete sense, that the idea of trying to achieve financial security and allowing others to achieve that stability and security, that's very conducive to a life of worship and leisure. And I think that's one of our obligations as Christians, is to use wealth in ways that foster entertainment, leisure, festivity in the way that we've described in this class. One of the plights of the wealthy is often to get even more and more ensconced in building wealth, right? So you've all probably, I'm thinking of the movie Wall Street. Remember that movie from the 80s? I think they remade it in the 21st century too. But this idea of a business person who's getting more and more wealthy, but getting more and more consumed with gaining wealth. Not using wealth as a means to pursue higher goods, but just using wealth as a means to grow more wealth, okay? I think in a Christian sense, that the ability that we have, especially in a country such as ours, to use our creativity in order to get the things that we need and to make money, even in abundance of just our daily material needs, right? You know, we have, in our country, you know, we have the ability to have these crazy things called savings accounts, right? A lot of the world would think that that's unbelievable, that we would have extra money that's not needed each day, right? Some people's savings accounts are bigger than others, but the idea is that even those of us that don't feel like we have a lot of money, we have the opportunity for great wealth in the scheme of human history and in compared to other parts of the world, right? That we should use that in order to pursue the higher goods, okay? And not just stay focused on those same goods. That's the point of achieving material security, at least in the sense that we've been talking about, is that then we can look to higher goods. But as I said, I think sometimes we can get trapped in that we can get trapped in this idea of only focusing on meeting our needs and never allowing ourselves to enter into this sphere of festivity, of leisure, of ritual. That's one of the things that Pieper talks about in his book, is that the whole point of a mandatory Sabbath is to say that even if you're poor, today you're not going to think about making more money, even if you're poor, because in the way Pieper describes, that's one of the most basic forms of slavery, is that if somebody feels like they're always scratching out their existence, well, they're never going to get away from that unless they purposefully set that aside, unless they say, you know what, I know I need to fill my barns, I know I need to finish my blacksmithing, I know I need to do some work to make some money, but you know what, I'm never going to be able to climb out of that poverty. I need to take time for worship. I need to make that time. And I think all of us can learn from that. There's always something else that we need to be doing, or that we feel like we need to be doing. There's always more work that needs to be done. We have to purposely set that aside and say, that's not what's most important right now. What's important right now is making time for my family, making time for worship, for prayer, for those truly human things, right? So I've included a couple of links to some articles just to maybe engage some different perspectives on economics and what's the point of it and what our goals should be. And I'll be interested to hear what you think of in your discussion boards.